This is the shared workshop session number 2 for the Moodle Gradebook, the Moodle/Open LMS Gradebook. And again, welcome everybody. Thank you again for joining today. The one thing again that I wanted to kind of start out with is the idea that some administrators may or may not. Well, I should say most administrators are probably familiar with the fact that there is a site admin grades area. Some new admins might not be familiar with that though, so that's something that it might be a given, but for those newer admins that might be in a role that an administrator role that they haven't been in the past, it's good to know that does exist. So there's that site administration grades, and then there's a number of subtopics within grades. And again, it allows you to set the gradebook defaults for a lot of certain settings. And these are just some highlights. Again, we're going to go into each subtopic essentially, but just some highlights in the general settings area. So site administration grades, and there's a general settings, and again, we'll see that a little bit later here. There's this recover grades default that you can see always recommended on. That's something that we typically always recommend that it being on. The bottom line here is if a student accidentally gets unenrolled from a course, and they should not be, if this option is checked, and you as an administrator or an instructor re-enrolls that user into a course, that user's grades will be automatically uploaded back into the course essentially. And I shouldn't say uploaded because it happens automatically. So yeah, the user's grades get added back into the course. If you don't have this option on, there's still an option. You can still recover grades, but it's not as easy. It takes a little bit more work. So, this is always, again, it's something that we typically recommend being on. So, in the grade category settings, so again, thinking back to what we talked about during the last call, we talked about the idea of when you're in a course in the gradebook setup area, there are grade categories. And at the site level, again, you can say, you can set the available aggregation types that instructors can use, for example. I was in a session with a client yesterday who was a new administrator, actually, and they weren't aware of the fact that you can make multiple. For example, they had one gradebook category that was enabled, so only the instructors could only use one gradebook category, or I should say aggregation type in any course. And when I showed them the idea that in addition to that, if you, for example, they wanted to make the natural aggregation type available in addition to the other one that they were using, they could do that at the site level, and then it wouldn't require the instructors to use that second one, but if they wanted to, they could. And then we're going to talk a little bit about knowing about forced and advanced settings. Again, that's in the grade category settings. Again, you guys might be familiar with this, but this is related to how these settings appear in the actual grade category in the course itself. Again, as you guys can probably imagine, forced means that you're essentially forcing that setting, and that setting is turned on by default, and you're forcing that. The advanced settings is more along the lines of if you can visualize, and again, as I go into the demo a little bit later here, but the idea of the advanced is that where do you want a certain setting to appear? For example, drop the lowest. Do you want that to appear in the main settings, or would the instructor have to click on the advanced drop down to show these advanced settings, if you will? In grades and site administration grades and grade item settings, there's a grade display type default value, which basically just means how is the grade display, what is the default value for the grade display? So you can set that again at the administrator level so that it cascades down into all the courses. And then into the report settings, knowing that you can change certain course level instructor report defaults. Again, as we talked about during the call last week, and as we saw, when you go to certain gradebook reports, there's a number of settings that can be changed by the instructor, but you as an administrator let's say you haven't really looked at the report settings in the past, or the instructor report default settings, you could say, okay, well, I typically have these questions throughout the year from instructors, and it'd be nice to, kind of default some certain settings. This is the way you could do that. So starting out with the grade category settings here. Again, now I'm going to highlight a little bit. And hey, Carrie, welcome to the session here. I'm going to highlight a little bit of the grade category set, and we're just about a slide or so in, Carrie. So again, welcome to the call, and feel free to speak up at any time if you have any questions or comments. But the grade category settings. So again, going back on what we talked about during the last call, a number of these settings can be changed at the default. So when you're in a course and you go into create a grade category, there's a number of settings that you can set up. Again, at the site admin level, you can default a certain category setting for those grade categories. For example, looking on the right-hand side, this little screenshot here, what's the default aggregation type for each course? What are the available aggregation types? So again, previous slide where I mentioned a client that I spoke with the other day, they only had weighted mean of grades available. So without a doubt, instructors, without question, they had to use weighted mean of grades. They didn't have an option of using anything else. So again, for those of you that may or may not be familiar with this area, it might be helpful to go into this area to kind of check and see what available aggregation types do you allow in your environments. And then you can see other settings such as exclude empty grades, keep the highest, drop the lowest. And you can see again in the screenshot, but I'll go into the demo environment a little bit later here. And you see the forced and advanced. And there's about, I believe it's the 4 settings. It's the exclude empty, keep the highest, drop the lowest, and one other that we'll see. But again, the general idea here is, what is it set to by default? Is it set to yes or no? And then forcing it. If you force that setting, that means that the instructor cannot remove that setting. Whether it's set to exclude empty grades might be set to yes. If that force checkbox is checked, that means that without question, every single course will force or will exclude empty grades because that setting's forced. And then that advanced, that just means, again, where does that setting appear in the actual category when you're looking at it there. So the user report, the reason why I'm highlighting this one is because that is the report that students see. And I think it's always important to know what settings do you have available. As an administrator, what options can you provide to the student on what they see? These are all of the options here. Settings include, again, I won't read every single one because I know, but show rank, show percentage, show grades, etc. The common settings that are usually turned on are things like show percentage, show grades, and show contribution to course total. But you can see some of these other ones that I typically are not turned on by default, like show rank. So if you wanted to, it would rank the students in order of where they land in the course. Show average. What's the average score of a certain assignment? Things like that. Show weighting. Weightings is one that's usually showed. But again, I'll go into detail here. But I think that this one, I always like to, when I talk to clients about Gradebook, I always like to take a moment and let people know that there are options to know, that you can change what students see. A lot of organizations, again, if they're not too familiar with the site administration settings, they might say, well, I'm sure it's hard-coded what the student sees and they see what they see. Well, again, knowing that there's some of these settings in here, you can actually determine, you could say, well, I don't want to show percentage because they're going to see that somewhere else or something, so Good to know. Grader report default settings. Again, so we went through a number of the reports last week at the course level, and kind of showed what each one is. And again, there is, just like the user report, there are grader report default settings. As a reminder, I know you guys are administrators. You guys, some of you might be instructors too, or past instructors. So you guys might already remember the fact that the grader report is essentially that grade book that shows the students enrolled on the left-hand side and all of the activities across the top. But again, there are a number of options that you can say, what do we want to include in the grader report for the instructors to see? Students per page. This is such a, I won't say a simple setting, but it's something that I had worked in support years ago, and it was a common question that I felt like I got, especially in larger courses, where there might be, maybe it's an intro course, introduction to history or something, and you have 150 students, and the instructor, I believe by default it defaults to about 25 students can be screened or can be shown on the instructor or in the grader report. And the students per page, if you want to change the ability to see how many students you can see on that page, the scrolling list, this is where you change. So again, I believe it's defaulted to 25, but if you want to allow instructors to be able to see 100, that's where you would do that. Again, there's other options in here: quick rating, quick feedback, show calculations, show column averages, etc. So again, we'll go into a little bit more detail, and you guys will actually be able to see some of these settings later. Then grade item settings. Again, this is another just sub area of grades that's important to know about. I think, again, it's going to be found by going to site administration, grades, and grade item settings. And then, again, just a couple highlights here. The grade display type. So how are grades displayed in the grader and the user reports? Again, pretty important in my opinion when you want to know what exactly students see in that user report. You can set it at the site admin level and say, let's ensure that at the site admin level, every course is set up with a certain grade display type, such as percentage, letter, etc. And welcome, Ed.
Sorry I was late.
No worries at all. Hope your day is going well.
It's been busy, but yes.
Yeah, sure. Good. Okay. Well, and we're only a couple slides in. We're just going through some topics here. And we again, this is for you and Carrie. I joined a little bit later too. We're doing kind of the same format as last week. We're going through a presentation, and then we will go into a demo environment. But the one thing I should probably kind of mention here, just while we have time, is that we're talking about the grade site admin settings. So everything associated with the site admin level side of things. Last week we talked a lot about, we went into a course and we talked about, the grader report and the gradebook setup area and the user report and things like that from the grade or from a course perspective. These are all more from the site admin perspective of, what can we set as defaults and things like that. So again, in the demo that I'm going to show in a little bit, you guys will really get a visual of yeah. You're welcome, Ed. Great. So again, grade display type. Yeah, the grade site admin grades and grade item settings. It's nice to know. Again, I've heard admins say, in the past that I've been in on support calls with and things like that. Well, I never realized that we could change the grade display type for a student. I just thought that the letter was showing the letter because that was the option. Again, it's good to know that at the site level you do have these other options. Overall decimal places. So again, this doesn't really. You can see. I always like to make a point here. There's no effect on grade calculation. So this is 100% visual. But do you want decimal places to show. So if somebody received, if there's a quiz or an assignment where somebody could receive a 95.5, do you want them to be able to see that 0.5, or do you want that just to be a round number there? And then advanced grade item options. So you can, again, we don't have a visual right here, right at the moment. I'm going to go into that in a little bit. You can select elements that should be displayed as advanced when editing grade items. So, and then just a couple. These are just again, knowing that we're outside of the course, and when I'm talking about certain settings here, I want to focus on the site admin settings, but there's other things that I want to. I just wanted to highlight here, managing grades. It's the idea that there's multiple ways for instructors to grade. And this is, again, just something that I would point out that includes they can grade an activity from the activity viewer or the module. So you click on the activity viewer or the module, and I should say, for example, the assignment. If you go into the course content area in section number 1 and assignment number 1, you click on assignment number, you can see how many submissions have been made, and then you can grade from there. Or a little bit more traditional, you can go into the course administration area and go to course administration, gradebook setup, and then from there you can access some of those reports that we talked about during the last call, single view grader reports. And then there's also an open grader report there, or an option to grade assignments that way. And then I talked about this a little bit during the last call, but the idea that that grade history report, and I put this under managing grades just because the idea of, if you have multiple instructors that are in a course and you're unsure of who edited a grade, again, I think this goes back to my support days when I think of, an administrator would reach out to us and maybe there's 3 or 4 instructors in a large course, and they say, well, somebody changed, this student's grade, and it wasn't any of the instructors, and that grade history report is really, really helpful in my opinion to be able to say, okay, you know what, let's actually dive into that. That's something I've worked with other learning management systems in the past that didn't have that. And it leads to really having to dive into like back-end logs to know this. And again, this might be something that's not as often used, but again, it's good to know if you do have multiple instructors and you might be a larger institution that, you're managing, hundreds of faculty. It's good to know who's done what. So. And then a couple other things that, again, we didn't really talk about during the last call because it's more, again, at the site level where you can set these things, but use of rating scales. So again, during the last call, we did talk a lot about actual, just the gradebook itself and the traditional settings, but what I didn't bring up was the idea that if you're an instructor, you might not be using the gradebook in a manner of, percentages and letter grades and things like that, but you might just want to have rating scales, meaning, I want a student to be graded on pass or fail, or you can even create your own custom rating scale, as you can see here. Our nursing faculty, Ed, you had mentioned our nursing faculty use this for skills competencies. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, yeah. And again, at the site level, this is something where you guys can say, what rating scales do we want to have available? All instructors have the ability to use rating scales, but again, for instructors that might be newer to the organization or just might not have been an instructor that long, they might not be familiar with the idea of what rating scales are. So I like to bring this up just so we can, again, see it at the site level, and so that you guys as administrators are aware of it's not only that you can only use, again, traditional sense of 80, percentages or letter grades. You can use a rating scale. And again, in addition, you can use custom scales too. So I'll show you a little bit later here what exactly that looks like from the site admin perspective. And then export import grades. And again, you can see I'm kind of jumping around a little bit from, on the topics a little bit here. Again, a reason being is just to kind of talk about some topics that we didn't talk about last week. Export import grades. This is nice to know about. With to know that the ability to, for example, this might not be as relevant right now, knowing that a lot is being done online and there's not maybe oral presentations, but something that I would like to think about is musical performances. If there's a music class and somebody, let's say there's and this could maybe even apply right now, in terms of if instructors have a music class and let's say they want to grade somebody's musical performance that they see on Zoom, there might not be a gradebook activity for that, but you can import grades from a course, or I should say from an Excel spreadsheet into a course. And let's say there are 75 students that are doing a musical performance in this music class. The way to do this is, best practice to import grades into the gradebook for, again, for grades that are not automatically calculated in the gradebook, because again, it's something that's being done outside of the LMS. What you could do is the instructor would go into the gradebook, export the actual gradebook itself, and it would give basically what that does is it essentially gives that file format that the instructor would need to import that back in. So they would export the gradebook settings there, and then modify the export file and then re-import the grades into the gradebook. And for example, with the musical performances, rather than having to go into each individual, you could create as I showed you last week, you could create an individual manual grade item within the grader report. Within the gradebook setup area, you could create a manual item. But again, the instructor would have to, type in 75 or 80 or something like that. This might make it a little bit easier to be able to do it in a spreadsheet and just import it into the gradebook there. So, any questions or comments about these last couple slides that we talked about in terms of exporting, importing, managing grades or rating scales? Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that as you're talking about the musical performances, it reminded me that if we haven't talked about it yet, rubrics might be a good topic to get into at some point.
Yeah. And so that's something we typically, I didn't have in my presentation. We can go into it a little bit here. The rubrics, the reason why I didn't include it here was I wasn't sure how much administrators really dealt with rubrics when it comes to kind of, setting them up. But yeah, we could definitely go into that a little bit later here. So, yeah.
I was also curious if you could go into OpenGrader a little bit more and what the limitations of that are, and possibly if does it have separate notifications than the regular gradebook?
The OpenGrader does not. It should be the same notifications.
Okay.
Let me see. Talking about rubric setup and use. Okay, and yeah, okay. Yeah, it should not, Rich.
Okay.
I'm just taking a couple notes here. Yeah, and we can definitely go into more detail. I only have a couple more slides here, and then we can go into the demo. And I think that's always it's always helpful during these types of presentations to actually get into an environment. So yeah, thanks guys. So yeah, let me actually jump out here for a moment and stop sharing, and we'll go back to the slides a little bit later here. So I only have a couple remaining here, but let's go back here. And it's taking a moment here. Let's see here. Okay. Should be loading up. There we go. Okay. Great. So let's go back. Let's go into my sandbox environment here, and we'll start there. So again, looking at what we had talked about at the very beginning of this presentation here is the idea that we wanted to talk about the grade site admin settings. So let's kind of start with that for a moment. And again, knowing that we have some other things that we might want to talk about, I won't spend a whole lot of time, but I always like to make everybody aware of, again, outside of courses, what grade settings appear and are available. So if I go to saturation grades, these are the settings that I was talking about earlier. Again, going into general settings, these are, for lack of a better term, fairly general. And we typically don't go through every single one of these. The one setting that I had referenced earlier during the presentation was recover grades default. For those of you that may or may not be familiar with this, what I had mentioned was here is that if you have this checked and a user is accidentally unenrolled from a course, if you automatically re-enroll them to a course, yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, if you re-enroll them into the course, those grades are re-enrolled automatically. Again, this is one that I had mentioned. It's always recommended being on. So I'd take a look at this and see if this is turned on. If it's not, you might have a reason for that. But again, most of the time, I feel like this is a pretty good setting to keep checked on. So. One other thing, and just a couple of highlights here in the general settings. If you have teachers if you have, let's say, continuing education, and you want teachers to be enrolled into courses as teachers, and you want them to be able to be, take a quiz as a teacher, the graded roles, again, might be something you guys might be familiar with, but to be able to take a test or a quiz or something like that as a teacher, you'd have to have the graded roles set to teacher. This graded roles just means what role can receive a grade. By default, obviously it's the student, right? But in this sense, I have I've had some organizations say, hey, let's make it so that our teachers can receive grades. Again, it might not be that common. They might only have one or two courses, but something to know about there. And again, you can see there's a lot of other settings. Aggregation position is one that's always, some organizations are, like to change this. This is, where does the course total appear? Does it appear at the end of the graded report, or does it appear at the beginning? So this is mostly for the instructor, but where do they want to see the course total there? And again, I won't go through every single one of these. You can see grade export decimal places, grade export user profile fields, etc. So, so that's the general settings there. The grade category settings here. So, so this is the second slide that we had talked about earlier. And again, I was talking with an organization the other day who had said they only had weighted mean of grades checked here, just like that. Or I believe it was actually simple weighted mean of grades. And the aggregate, so this is the default aggregation type, this aggregation option here. So this means that, if simple weighted mean of grades is selected as a dropdown, every course by default that gets created the course category will be simple weighted mean of grades. If you force this, that is truly that nobody else is going to have any, no instructors are going to have any other option here to choose a different aggregation type. In addition, again, the other client that I was working with the other day, this was the only one that they had checked. And we were talking about what other aggregation types are available. I was showing them in my environment how you can use natural, and we were talking about weighting grades, and I had mentioned that, and they said, okay, great, we'll probably use that. And I said, well, do you have it available at the site level? And they said, we're not sure. So I went into here. I saw it was set like this. So I said, you know what? If you want to use have the option of using natural in courses, do that here. Make that natural option selected. And then going into these other options, exclude empty grades, include outcomes and aggregation, keep the highest, drop the lowest. And then you see forced and advanced. And again, some of you guys might be familiar with this, but the idea here is exclude empty grades. If you force this, and whether it's yes or no, this means that the instructors at the course level cannot change it. So if I had this set to yes and I forced it, every course would exclude empty grades with no questions asked. If I, again, if I did no, same thing. It would not force. Or I'm sorry, exclude empty grades would not be included, but it would be forced. So you have the option of setting the default here, forcing it, and then the advanced, that just means where exactly does this appear in a course. So, and I'll just quickly show you. So if I go to my courses here, you can kind of get an idea, a visual of what exactly this means. So if I go into Gradebook setup, and I go to the grade category settings here, and I go to edit settings. The advanced is where is it showing? And this is what's considered advanced. Show more and show less. So you can see if I go back here, all of the options are included as advanced. So exclude income, include outcomes and aggregation, keep the highest, etc. If I click show more, include outcomes and aggregation, drop the lowest. So that's, again, this isn't groundbreaking information, but I thought it's helpful to know, because some instructors might come in here and say, well, they might glance over show more and not click on that, or you might want them to, without a doubt, see exclude empty grades and not have to click on show more. And by doing that, we could go back here and say, let's not include this in the advanced area. So again, I think it was just important to know that from a site level is what are the options here. Again, I think it's pretty important to know about the available aggregation types. I feel like a lot of organizations do know about that, but again, the person that I spoke with the other day didn't. So just something good to know about there. And then I'll go back into scales and letters in a little bit here, but the report settings. So this is another slide that I had mentioned about the user report default settings. So knowing that at site administration, report settings, and user report, you can determine what students will see by default. So again, you can see by default I have show percentage, show grades, show feedback, ranges, weightings. I have average in mind. But again, the user report is that report that students will see and that the instructors can see too. It's good to know that if you don't want them to see, for example, the feedback in that user report area, you want them to see the feedback in the when they click on the actual assignment. You can say, okay, let's uncheck show feedback from the user report, and we only want them to see the feedback when they go into the actual assignment itself. Show letter grades, whether to show a column for letter grades. And again, this all goes to the idea of just, again, to give you a full visual here. Let's go into course administration, reports, Gradebook setup, sorry. And user report. So we're seeing all of these calculated weight, grade, range, percentage, average, feedback. So again, I've heard organizations say, why is this option showing? Why is this average showing? Why is the feedback showing? It's all related to this site admin user report settings here. So if you want to really simplify that and make it a little bit more, a little bit more simple, you can do that by unchecking these options here. So show hidden items. Again, that gets into something that I didn't necessarily, wasn't included, is specifically talking about hidden items, but whether hidden grade items are hidden entirely, or if the names of hidden grade items are visible to students. So again, this goes back to the idea. I haven't heard of a lot of organizations, using that hidden grades or hidden assignment options that often. But if you were, you can see quiz sample. That quiz, I hid that just to show a client the other day, and this is where, from a student perspective, would they see that's hidden. Again, I think you need a little bit more of a use case to understand that a little bit more. So, and then that show contribution to course total. I think that's helpful to know too, is contribution to course total. What is the contribution of a certain assignment to the course total? So, and then again, the grader report, I had a slide for that where we talked about, and you can see here that setting that I mentioned earlier, students per page. So how many students display in the grader report? And again, this isn't groundbreaking, but if you have an instructor that has a course that has 200 students, is it going to show 25 students where they're going to have 8 pages, or can you let them change it to where they're going to show more than the right now it's set at 100, but in the past it's been set at 25. So also in the grader report, show only active enrollment. So if users are suspended, do you want them to appear in that grader report? A lot of instructors would say, you know what, if I have a suspended student, I do not want to see them in here because it's confusing for me. So that checkbox option, show only active enrollments, means that those suspended students will not appear in that grader report. And then quick grading and quick feedback. You can see when editing is turned on, a text box appears for each grade, allowing many grades to be edited at a time. Again, I feel like this is one that I don't see it. I haven't heard it being used all that often by a lot of organizations because they do the traditional grading using the grader report or the grade or the open grader, things like that. But if you click turn editing on, by me having quick grading checked here at the site level, it allows me as an instructor to be able to add grades in here as I want. If that option was not checked, if that quick grading option was checked, I wouldn't be able to do that. And you can see quick feedback is not checked, so I cannot add in feedback in here. So again, just some settings that you may or may not be familiar with at the site admin level that I think it's important to know about there. So our faculty do use it, especially for seated courses, which are still required to have updated LMS grade. Yeah, okay. Good to know, Ed. Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. One other thing, and you can see I won't go through every single one of these settings in the essence of time, and there's some other settings that we want to talk about here. Show locks, show ranges, show graded. Again, you might take some time, and if you're not familiar with this page, look at some of these a little bit more at a later time. But one that, again, I was talking with an organization the other day, show calculations. The show calculations is related to, and again, I'm going to go into the gradebook setup in this course. And this is something where you really, from an instructor perspective, you have to know what exactly you're doing here. But if you want to create a formula to have your gradebook calculated in a certain manner. If you have this, again, this is it's at the grader report, so it's I wouldn't, when I would think about this, I wouldn't think for this setting to be in the grader report area, but it has to be somewhere. So the reason why I bring this up is show calculations. If this is checked, I, as an instructor, can go to the gradebook setup area here and click on edit calculation, and I can input a certain calculation to calculate the grades in my gradebook. You can see here, again, it's a formula, if you will, right? And if you click, so I don't go into a whole lot of detail in terms of the grade calculations. I think people that know how to use the grade calculations really have a good understanding of it. So, but there's documentation here. If you go to the grade calculations, it goes into detail about what you can really do in terms of, you can see here the calculation functions, which I think are helpful to know about. But again, somebody that isn't familiar with grade calculations, they'd really have to do some reading up and kind of understand what exactly all this is here. So, but I just wanted to point that out because algebra, woohoo. So then the last thing that I wanted to show here, and before we talk about, we can talk about the Open Grader a little bit more and rubrics a little bit more here too, but if I go into grades, the last thing that I mentioned in my presentation there a little bit was scales. So if I go to site administration, grades, and scales, this is what I was talking about in terms of, I've had some organizations that I've worked with that they're corporate organization that says, you know what, Mike, we're not using the LMS in a traditional sense. We're not going to grade people on, whether they received an 80% on the quiz. We just want to know, did they pass or fail it? And they rely heavily on these scales. And you can see here, so the standard scales that are set up in everybody's environments. And then you can see, are these scales actually being used? And this correlates with whether a scale is being used in a course. So that's good to know. And you can see the only one that I'm using, and again, this is just a sandbox environment, but is the BTEC, which is, refer, pass, merit, distinction, and then scale 1 to 5. But if you ever wanted to change any of these, you can click on the gear icon here, and you can change this however you'd like. So with the BTEC, that's one that's typically, you don't have the option of changing here. But again, you can add a new scale in here. So if you had a scale that you wanted to, a custom scale is what I was talking about earlier briefly. If I click add a new scale, that's where you can add whatever you'd like. So if you, going back to the idea that, if you have a course that maybe it's an elective or something like that, and again, students don't, the instructor says, I don't want to do the whole percentages and everything like that. I want to keep it simple. You can create a custom scale here, and just as easy, the words that instructors might use in terms of scaling, you can associate that with the actual quote unquote grades in the LMS. So, any questions about the scales or anything about there? And I know, Ed, you had mentioned that those are used with the competencies in your nursing program there. So, yeah. And again, every instructor, so let me show you here. Let's go back. Sorry, I was jumping around a little bit. If I'm in a gradebook setup area as an instructor, and I go to scales, I have the option of seeing all these scales. So again, from a perspective of the site administrator, you might say, well, yeah, I don't want instructors to be able to use the 150-point scale or 200-point scale, or some of these other ones. I'm going to delete it at the site level, and that way, they're not going to see it. So, just something good to know about there. One of the last settings, just briefly, I'm going to point this out, but I'm guessing that everybody knows about this setting. Site administration, grades, and letters. How are letters set up here? And again, I've been with this being my sandbox. I often change certain settings just to samples for clients. But what is considered? What's the grade range for an A? What's the grade range for an A minus, B plus, so on and so forth? If you weren't familiar with this setting, I always like to just point out that this is where you can find it. This does cascade again down into courses, and even at the course level, the instructor can edit the scale. But you can see I have 1, 2. I was working with an organization the other day that said, rather than showing A, B, C, etc., we have our letters are considered numbers essentially. So we still use percentages, but the students aren't familiar with A, B, C, D for those purposes. They're associated with the numbers. So that's where I showed them, just as easy. You can say edit grade letters and say, let's make this 1, 2, etc. So I'll change this back. And then again, what's the scale? Where does that A end, and that A minus begin, etc. So with that being said, and again, we still have some time here. Oops. The idea here, so let's go into the course itself, into my course itself. And so let's see here. Yep, sorry, I got, too many tabs open sometimes. So I'll go into this course here. And so if I go into course administration, and again, this was just a slide that I had in my presentation. I had mentioned that I jumped around a little bit, but it was more at, during the first session of this gradebook, the gradebook workshop here, I wanted to focus entirely on the course. And during the second session, I focused on those site admin settings, but then I just wanted to mention a couple tips and tricks. And one of the things on the slides that I mentioned earlier was the fact that, just as a reminder, you can grade in a number of ways. You can grade by going into, a certain activity and seeing, let's see, so assignment number 1, I can click 1 of 15 submitted, and I can grade this way, I can edit the grade here. Or I can go into the grade report and use that override here. Or the other option, again, is going into the course administration and going to Open Grader here. So the Open Grader, the nice thing that the Open Grader allows you to do is it has the option of having the grade area here, having the comments and the feedback all there, and then you can see you can go from one assignment to the next and go from one student to the next too. So you might say, for this, I have, BB Chenoweth is the student. I'm going to give them a 10. It does have this annotate PDF option if a Word document or something was submitted, but activity comments, you can see here, do great job and save the comment here, and then save grade next. And what it does is it stays in assignment number 1 and goes to Mike Chenoweth, who's the next person. So yeah, and one other thing that I'd mentioned, I don't, this was, and I haven't seen a client ask about this recently, but a couple years ago, I feel like I'm calling them things to remember, kind of highlights. When grading open forms and assignments, use the Open Grader to view the submission in 2-pane view and add comments in the grade. So it's just a couple kind of tips and tricks. The grader report, the most traditional view of the gradebook, is what I kind of like to say, offers that table view of student achievement. But it also, as we had mentioned, allows for individual student overrides and grade editing for items such as locking and excluding. And then the student view of the gradebook, the user report, is also available for instructors to view. I think that's important to just a little bit of a reminder to have in the back of the instructor's head that, you know, if the student is confused on what they're seeing in the gradebook, they can always go to that user report and see exactly what what the student is seeing there. So we do have just an in-session practice assignment. If you guys, again, we have about 15 more minutes or so. Sometimes we have these sessions. You guys have probably seen the way we do this in previous workshops here, but we can kind of work on this together. And then we have a homework assignment also that's kind of a follow. The assignment is actually in the train site. Let me just show you this. Let me go out to the train site here. So really like the idea of talking about rubrics at a more advanced scale. Again, I'm gonna take that as a follow-up. I think we could find a lot of or a handful of organizations that would really find that useful. So hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you all soon.